Hey everybody, today we're going to do some live coding to demonstrate how easy it is to interact with external APIs in a Spring Boot application and to demonstrate the benefit of unit tests to refine the responses that you get from that API. So I'm starting out at start.spring.io, the best place to start when you're building a Spring Boot project. And to start with, we're just going to select the web dependency, and I'm going to give this a nice group name, and for artifact we'll call this DigitalOcean API demo because we're going to interact with the DigitalOcean API. So let me generate that project, and now I'm going to come over here and I'm going to unzip that project. Would help if I spelled out downloads right. We called it DigitalOcean. Okay. Now I'm going to jump over to IntelliJ and I'm going to open the POM file from this project. I'm going to open it as a project, and now it's going to do all of the importing for us, and we can get started right away. First thing we're going to do is create a new package called controller, and we're going to make our first controller. Super easy with Spring Boot. We'll call it DO API controller. DO is commonly referred to for DigitalOcean in the community. So we're going to make this a REST controller, and let's make a request mapping. We'll call this list droplets. Droplets are the name that DigitalOcean uses for their virtual machines. And we're going to make this a response body because everything we do is going to be JSON. And to start with, we're going to return a simple map, and we'll call this list droplets, and let's return null to start with. Import map. I like to have this all on the same line. Okay. Now we can fire up our application. It's going to start up in just a second, and I'm going to use the HTTP command line, and that is curl replacement. It's just more modern and is a little nicer to work with, but you could just as well use curl. And I'm now going to hit our endpoint list droplets, and we get a 200 response, which is empty as we would expect. So far, so good. Let's kill this. Now, we want to put all of the complexity into a service. So I'm going to go ahead and make another package. I'll call it service. And now I'm going to make a new Java class. This is going to be the interface to our service. Let's call it DO API service. Okay. And here we're going to have a service that returns a map, and we'll call it list droplets. Okay. And now back in our controller, we're going to auto-wire this service. Now, of course, we don't have an implementation yet, but we'll get to that in just a second. So now, instead of returning null, we're going to return DO API service list droplets. So our controllers are super small. All the business logic is in our service. So far, so good. Notice it's saying that it can't find anything to auto-wire. So let's go ahead and make an implementation here. We'll call it DO API service impl. I know there are people that are not fond of that impl pattern anymore, but for now we're going to do it. We're going to annotate this with service. We're going to tell it that it implements our DO API service. It's complaining. So let's go ahead and implement those methods. And sometimes IntelliJ is a little weird. Come on, IntelliJ. There we go. Just looking for the little red light bulb. We're going to implement these methods. Okay. And for now, I'm still going to have it be null. So all we've done is abstracted the business logic out to a server, but let's just make sure everything's still working while we rapidly prototype here. I expect to get the same exact output as before. Good, everything's still working. So basically, we're kind of just working on the framework here, the plumbing, and nothing's happening against our real API. Now, let's hook us up to our real API. So I know that I want to use HTTP client, and I want to use the Apache HTTP client Fluent interface. And I never remember where those Maven listings are because we want to add those dependencies. So I'm just going to do a search for HTTP client Maven. Maybe there's a better way, but this always gets me right to what I need. So I'm just going to snag this dependency, and I'm going to add that to our POM file right here. And now I also know that I want the HTTP client Fluent interface. We'll talk about that in just a second. So let's go and get that. Let me just double check that that's the latest. No, they match. So let's go get the latest. Okay. I think this is one of the few failings of IntelliJ, and maybe I just don't know how to do it, but it would be really lovely if I could just look up my dependencies right from IntelliJ and add them in. All right, let's jump back to our impl here, and now let's do an interaction with the DigitalOcean API. Oh, and also if you see down here, we definitely want to enable auto import so that it has those new dependencies. Okay, so now here we're going to use the Fluent API. So we'll import the Fluent request, which you can see up here. And I know that I need to add a header for authorization, and I know that that's going to be a bearer token. We'll figure that all out in a sec. I also know that I want the content type to be application JSON. Okay, then we're going to, what are we going to do here? We're going to execute our request, and we're going to return the HTTP response, and from there we're going to get our entity, and finally, actually let's leave it at that. We'll get our entity. So let's say HTTP entity equals this, and you can see there's all kinds of complaints. Let's deal with those complaints. This is probably because we need to deal with the signature. So I just told IntelliJ to add this exception both to the interface and our implementation. Okay. Now once we have that entity, we still want to convert that to something that we can use in Java. It's all JSON. So what we're going to do is we're going to make use of the built-in Jackson mapper. So this is built into Spring Boot, making our lives super easy. And we're also going to use this, let's make this final, why not? And let's also make a type reference. This just gives hints to the mapper, which we'll see in use in a second, to properly marshal and unmarshal JSON objects. Okay, so there's going to be a new type reference, and it'll be map string object. Okay, let's see what this is complaining about. What did I do wrong here? Let's see what I did wrong. Oh, I see what I did wrong. Notice up here, this is the wrong type reference. We don't want JDK internal. We want a different type reference. So let's grab the right one. And this time it did it automatically, and it gave us the Jackson Core type reference. Let's see what we're complaining about here. Let's see, did I? Oh, right. There we go. All right, so we're just using the Java syntax here to force it to instantiate this abstract type. All right. So now at this point we have our entity, and what we're going to return is mapper read value, and it's going to be our entity. So we're going to give it an input stream, and we're going to give it a type ref, and Jackson will do the magic for us to resolve that. Okay, so last bit of housekeeping we need to do here is to actually put in the proper reference, which is API DigitalOcean.com v2 droplets. And we need a bearer token. So to do that, I'm going to go over to my DigitalOcean API account, and I'm going to generate a new token, and we'll call this LiveCoding test, and I'm going to make it read only just in case you guys want to copy this number. Don't worry, I'm going to delete it afterwards, but it's read only anyway. So I've just copied it. And for now, I'm going to hard code it. Obviously, you wouldn't do this in real life. You'd have this be some sort of environment variable, or look it up or get it in some other way. And I think that is all that we need to do. Okay, so let's take a look at our program now. What did I do? Right. I need to deal with this exception because now we're dealing with real life. And let's fire it up. Should just take a second. A few seconds, actually. Okay. Now we're running again. Let's see what kind of response we get. Huzzah! So there's an empty list. I don't have any droplets currently. Let me just fire up a quick droplet here just to show that we actually get some info back, and I'm going to keep this super basic. Come on, DigitalOcean. You can do it. All right, so we're going to do their cheapest thing, which is less than a cent an hour, and I will make sure to destroy it before an hour so that I don't pay more than a cent for it. All right, it's firing up this droplet. So now let's hit our API again, and now we're getting back a real response. So far, so good. Okay, so now everything that we've done so far has just been set up for the main event. The main event here is that I would like to interact with more Java idiomatic objects than just this map string object. And I can set up some tests so that I can do that in a really civilized way and not have to keep hitting the real API and have real machines running to see what I'm getting back. And this is going to incorporate some interesting libraries, because if you notice here, we're using this nice fluent interface, but that is a static method, and those are often hard to test. Okay, so let's go here and add a test. So what we're going to test here is our service layer. So I'm going to add a new test called DO API service test. Nothing surprising so far. Okay, now I know there's a couple of dependencies that I'm going to want to add here to make this work properly. And again, I'm going to do my little lookup trick. But the dependencies that I want are EasyMock and PowerMock. PowerMock is the thing that enables us to test static calls. And I'm also going to add Hamcrest, which you've never heard of. It makes a nice, fluent, functional interface for assertions. So let's go and add all of that right now. So I'm going to do a little Maven search for EasyMock. And we'll go and grab that. And notice that our scope there is test. So we're going to add this to the test section. Now I want to do PowerMock Maven. And there's a couple of PowerMocks, and I just happen to know this just from experience. So we want the PowerMock module for JUnit 4. We'll grab that guy. We also want the PowerMock module for EasyMock. So Maven, EasyMock. There's a plugin to make PowerMock work with EasyMock. It also works with Mockito, if you've heard of those. So let's grab this guy. So now I've got EasyMock, I've got PowerMock, I've got the PowerMock API for EasyMock, and then the last thing I want to add here is Hamcrest for our project. And we probably only really need Hamcrest core, but I'm going to be lazy and just get all of Hamcrest. We'll see that in action in just a moment. Okay, so those are all the new dependencies that I need. And now we can actually start adding to our test. Okay, so let's start here, and we're going to start with a test. And we're going to make it testable, and we're just going to call it test list droplets. Okay, so a couple of bits of housekeeping. First of all, we want to use this run with annotation to tell it that we're going to use the PowerMock runner. Now, if I've done everything right, PowerMock runner should be available for us. Excellent. And in order to be able to test static methods, we need to use the prepare for test annotation, and in this case it's going to be our request class. And there's probably a lot of those, so let's make sure we get the right one. We want the request fluent one. Okay, so far so good. Okay, now what we're going to do here, let's just outline our steps. Okay, so first of all, we're going to set up our mocks. Then we're going to set up our expectations. Then we're going to replay. This replay business is a part of EasyMock. If you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to look it up. Okay, then we're going to exercise our class under test. Then we're going to verify. This is also part of EasyMock, so we're going to verify that the things we expected to be called were. And finally, we're going to make some assertions. Okay, so the first thing we need is a static mock. This is part of PowerMock for request.class. Okay, and you can see up here that we've done a static import. That's all very nice. And now I already know that I'm also going to need a mock of the request class itself. So let's call this request, and we're going to mock our request.class, and we're going to import that. Okay, and notice we have two options here. We're going to use Easy Mock. All right, so far so good. Now, to follow this through, to see, again, the goal here is to set up a unit test that's going to make our lives easier in making our droplet response more Java idiomatic, but we don't want to actually be making API calls to DigitalOcean. So we're going to mock all of this out, and it's actually not too bad. So notice we have our request get, okay, and then we have this fluent interface, and we want to follow that through in our mock setup. Okay, so let's jump down here to our expectations section, and we're going to say expect request.get. I'm going to leave this empty, and it's going to return our request mock. I'm going to import that static method. All right, we'll come back to what goes in here in a second. Next, we're going to expect request add header, and it's also going to return this request mock, right? Because this is our fluent interface, so we keep returning it. Now, in order to make this a little bit easier on ourselves and not have to put in the exact settings, I'm going to use this EQ, and we know that the first call to add header is for authorization. And add header takes two parameters. Our second parameter is going to be any string. So I don't really care in this particular case. I'm not exercising the exact string that was passed, so I'm going to make my life a little easier and just say that any string, we expect any string to be passed in for this add header. Okay, we also have another add header request, and this time I'm just going to spell it out because it's easy enough to do. Okay, so this is going to be our content type, and we know that our content type needs to be application JSON, and we're still going to return the request. All right, so far so good. Okay, now what we're going to do with the request is we're going to execute it, just like we have over here. We're just following this down line by line. So we're going to say we expect that request.execute is going to be called, and then we're going to return a response, which we haven't defined yet. But we can go through here and we can say response, response, and now we're going to mock out a response class. And again, we want the response from our Fluent API. That's what we're working with. Let's see what this is complaining about. Ah, right. So we need to add this IO exception. That's fine. All right. Again, we're following down. Now we're going to use the response. We're still in our Fluent API here. And we're going to call the return response. And this returns an HTTP response. Okay, that's this guy. All right, so once again, we're going to define that mock. We're going to say HTTP response, mock, HTTP response. This is again from org Apache HTTP class. All right. Next step is to get our entity. Expect HTTP response to get entity and return entity. Jumping back up here, we're going to say HTTP entity. You see the pattern that's emerging here? We can kind of follow this through and jump back and forth and make it pretty easy to mock all this out. And again, the ultimate goal here is once we have this all mocked out, we want an easy way to start refining our droplet response. Okay, so now we're up to the point of get entity. Awesome, so far so good. Now, before we continue, let's jump down here. Now we know that on this entity, we're going to be calling get content, and get content is going to take an input stream. So let's look at how that's going to work. So here I'm going to say expect our entity, oops, it would help if I spelled it out right, get content, that's going to return an input stream. So we're going to have this input stream named IS. Now what is that input stream exactly going to be? What I'd like to do is have a concrete model object that represents what is actually coming back from DigitalOcean. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to load up a file, and this allows me to set up fixtures. I could do this in multiple tests. So I'm going to have a fixture that is a JSON file that we're going to read in this input stream so that our Jackson mapper can produce a proper response. All right, let's see what this looks like. So we know that this is going to be an input stream. Let's start there, and we're going to call it IS. Now, I know also that it's going to be a file input stream because I'm going to be reading a fixture from a file. And Spring Boot also gives us a nice leg up here because it has a class path resource object where we can give it a file name in the class path, in the resource class path, and it'll just find it. So let's just call this do API list droplets response.json. And let's see what this is complaining about. Oh, right. Once we have this class path resource, we want to get the file from it. Okay, so now our file input stream is all good. So now all we have to do here, because Spring Boot makes this so easy for us, is to create a new directory in our test folder. We're going to call it resources, and DigitalOcean makes this nice and easy for us because we can actually look at their API documentation, and here's the documentation for list all droplets, and here is a response that we expect to get back. So I am just going to copy this response, and I'm going to paste that right into a file called do API list droplet response.json. Probably could have made my life a little easier with a shorter file name. Okay, this is very cool. So this is just a JSON file now. I don't know what it's complaining about. We'll get back to that. But one of the things I want to show you is that this in fact has 3 sections: droplets, links, and meta. We're going to get back to that in a second. But first, we're almost ready to actually make sure this thing is working. Okay, so now we've got everything built up that we need to get this set up. Now, as part of EasyMock, once we've done all these expectations, we're now going to replay our various mocks. So we're going to replay, and for each mock that we have, now this is special to Power Mock, where you're calling request.class, and then for each of the other mocks that we have up here, we're going to say request, response, HTTP response, and entity. Okay. Now there is a replay all, which is kind of a convenience, but I like to spell this out. And because we're doing the static method calls, we want to do the Power Mock replay and not the EasyMock replay. Okay. Now let's do a little bit of sort of cheating here, and we are literally going to instantiate our service. And we're going to say map string object, if I spell it right. Let's call it droplet response equals, and we're going to call our servless just like that, our service. Okay. Now again, this is a nice part of EasyMock. We're going to verify the very same thing. So we're going to come back up here, and I'm going to be a little lazy and copy and paste. And again, we're going to verify, we're going to use the PowerMock version of this method. Okay. Now, finally, we can make some assertions. We're going to assert that our droplet response size is 3. Okay, we got to do a couple of imports here. And for some reason, this never quite, IntelliJ kind of chokes on this. Let's see, we got it. Okay, so from Hamcrest, we're going to do assert that. And let's see if it'll be nice to us with our is. It's not. Maybe. Nope. All right, so I don't understand exactly why IntelliJ sometimes can't find this. But we have enough to go on here to properly import it. So we know it's Hamcrest, and it's core matchers, and it's is. Okay? Now that we have this, this is good. One of these days I'll figure out why IntelliJ can't find that. So now we have our complete test. We have all our mocks. Everything should work. It'll be amazing if it goes first time out, but let's run our test and see what we get. I hit Control-Shift-R in IntelliJ, which will run this test. All right, I didn't think it would happen first try. Let's see what it's complaining about. Yes. I never did put in what the proper expectation here is. So we're actually going to be lazy and just hard code it in here. Let's go back to our test. And let's run this again. All right, let's see why it's blowing up now. Still not liking it. All right, let's see. It's barfing online. It's live. It doesn't like line 44. DO API. Let's see if I spelled this right. Droplets response. All right, this is what I get for making such a long, ugly, gnarly name. This is droplets, plural, response. Actually, I want it to be droplet response, so let me change it here. Okay. Should have made it an easier name, but let's run it again. All right, red, green, go. So what we know now is that it was able to read this droplet JSON response file, and it was able to use all of the object mapper magic and use our mocks and get us all the way through here so that we got back the proper type. Now, you may be saying, this is a lot of setup for a little bit of payoff. But what this enables us to do now is to start refining our response to make it more idiomatically Java without having to actually fire up droplets and actually interact with the DigitalOcean API. So I could do this on a bus or a plane without having access to DigitalOcean, and we'd be able to make progress. Let me show you what I mean by that. So I'm going to create a new package, and I'm going to call this model. And let's make a new Java class, and let's call it droplet response. Okay, and what we know so far from what we saw of the DigitalOcean output is that we have 3 sections here. We have a droplets section, we have a meta section, and we have a, bear with me a second, a links section. Mess that up. Let's make that a map. Okay, let's import our map. Okay, and now I know some people are fans of the Lombok project. I really don't know it yet. I have to get into it, but it makes it so that you don't need this boilerplate code. One of these days I'll get into it, but for now, just using IntelliJ to give me the boilerplate code that we need. All right, so now we have this droplet response. So now what I can do over here in our service is make this a little more Java civilized and have it return a droplet response. I'm going to hit Control-Alt-O and get rid of unnecessary imports. That's a very handy IntelliJ thing. Now everything is broken, of course, because this isn't set up right. So here we're going to make this return a droplet response. And let's do our type reference. Rather than a map, we're going to have it be a droplet response now. I'm going to change this to be a droplet response. And this should all be good. Now I could just hit the DigitalOcean API for real and see if this all works, but now we have this lovely test that's going to be our friend. I do want to update the controller here now though, and again this is making it nice and civilized for us. So we're now returning a droplet response, and let's go over to our test and refactor our test and see if things work. So I don't have to change any of this setup stuff. We've got all our mocks in place, but of course we're getting an error here because it's returning something different. So let's set up droplet response now. And now that we have a droplet response, we know that we're going to get back a certain number of droplets. So we call the get droplets, and let's call size on that. We expect that to be 1. So if we look over here, there's only, in this array, there's only one of these droplets that's defined. While we're at it, let's see which is simple here. Let's look at meta, because that's a simple one, and we expect the total on meta to be 3. So let's go over here, and I'm just going to copy and paste because I'm being lazy. And let's do get meta. And instead of size, let's call get, what did we say it was? It was total. So let's call get total, and we expect that value to be 3. Okay, so now we've refined our droplet response, and we still have this lovely unit test that we can now refactor to make sure that our response is what we expect it to be. So let's run our test again and see what we get. First try, fingers crossed. Oh, not first try. Let's see what happened. Okay, all right, so we're getting some Jackson mapper issues here, so let's see if we can figure that out. Let's see if we can find where it's dying. So it's not happy right here, right at our type ref. So it's having trouble resolving this entity into this type droplet response. All right, so let's take a look at droplet response, droplets, meta, and link, and let's just make sure that things match up over here. Droplets, links, and meta. Let's make sure I called it links because that matters. I did. Okay, the order really shouldn't matter. So let's see why else it may be unhappy with this. It's saying you cannot deserialize links hash map at a start array token. Droplet response, droplets. Now this file here was giving us an error before. Let's see if it still is. I probably shouldn't have ignored it. It doesn't look like it is anymore. So it should be okay with droplets. Ah, of course, this is an array, and I made it a map string. So let's fix droplet response. This should be a list of map string object, not just a map string object. Okay, we've done that. Of course, now we need to fix our getters and setters. So I'm going to be lazy and let IntelliJ do it for me. Going to generate getter and setter for list. There we go. And let's try this again. All right, now we're green. So that wasn't so bad, right? And we got to debug and make sure that our model object is actually matching our the response that we're getting from DigitalOcean. And I was able to do all of that without actually hitting the DigitalOcean API. Thank you, unit tests. So now we could continue to drill in here and make these more refined objects. So for instance, inside a droplet, we have all this other stuff, right? So I could make a droplet type and add that to model, and I could add ID, name, memory, and start to build that out. We're not going to do that here in the interest of time, but hopefully you get what's going on. All right, so last thing is I'm going to fire up my application once again. Let's see, do I still have it running? No. I'm going to fire it up one more time, and now we're actually going to hit our endpoint, which will actually hit the DigitalOcean API, and everything should still work, assuming we haven't busted anything. Let's take a look. All right, and there we go. We get our response, and all that tells us is that Jackson is able to do its job. So over here, Jackson is able to return a droplet response. So hopefully you have enjoyed this deep-ish dive into getting set up with unit tests to interact with an API using a fixture. So the major things we hit on here are using PowerMock to deal with static method calls, and we used fixtures to give us a response and to work with a response so that we could further refine it all inside of our unit tests before we had to jump back to the real thing.